The massive doors of the Galactic Council chamber slid open with a sound that echoed through the enormous hall. Captain Dae-sung walked forward, his boots clicking against the polished crystal floor. Behind him, Lieutenant Hana carried a data case containing humanity's most important discovery. Their hearts pounded, but their faces remained calm and professional. The council chamber was breathtaking. It floated in space above a purple and blue planet, with transparent walls showing the stars beyond. 12 massive thrones surrounded a central platform where Dae-sung now stood. Each throne held a representative from the galaxy's oldest and most powerful species. Some looked like giant insects, others resembled flowing water, and some had forms that hurt to look at directly. At the highest throne sat Prelate Vaktar of the Centauri Dominion. He was tall and covered in golden scales that shimmered under the chamber's lights. His 4 eyes studied Dae-sung with obvious disinterest. The Centauri had ruled the council for over 10,000 years. To them, humanity was barely worth noticing. Dae-sung cleared his throat and began to speak. His voice was steady despite the nervousness churning in his stomach. He explained how Earth's deep space monitoring stations had detected something terrible. A massive threat was moving through space toward the galaxy. They called it the Void Swarm. It consumed everything in its path, leaving only empty space behind. Entire star systems had gone silent as it approached. The holographic display above Dae-sung's head showed the evidence. Graphs, sensor readings, and mathematical calculations filled the air. Hana stepped forward and added more technical details. The swarm would reach council space in 8 cycles, maybe less. It was enormous, possibly covering light years of space. Nothing humanity knew of could stop it alone. Prelate Vaktar leaned forward slightly. His expression showed something between amusement and irritation. He spoke in a deep voice that seemed to vibrate through the floor itself. He asked how long humanity had been traveling in space. Dae-sung answered honestly. 200 years. Just 2 centuries since humans left their home system. The council chamber filled with sounds that might have been laughter from various alien species. Vaktar's scaled face twisted into what looked like a smile. He declared that the Centauri Dominion had been exploring the galaxy for 12,000 years. Their sensors were the most advanced in known space. If this void swarm existed, they would have detected it long ago. Another council member spoke up, a being made of crystalline structures that refracted light in rainbow patterns. She suggested that perhaps humanity's primitive sensors had simply malfunctioned. Maybe they were seeing echoes of old supernovas or misreading natural phenomena. Young species often made such mistakes. Dae-sung felt anger rising in his chest, but he pushed it down. He explained that 3 separate human research stations had confirmed the readings. Earth's best scientists had spent months verifying the data. This was real. The threat was coming, and everyone needed to prepare. A slug-like creature from the lower thrones made gurgling sounds that the translation device rendered as dismissive questions. How could humanity possibly detect something the council could not? What made humans think they understood the galaxy better than species who had been studying it for millennia? Hana stepped closer to Dae-sung. She projected additional images showing the swarm's effects on nearby systems. Planets stripped of all matter. Stars dimmed and dying. Radio silence where thriving civilizations once broadcast. She pleaded with the council to at least send their own ships to investigate. Time was running out. Vaktar raised one clawed hand for silence. The chamber became quiet. He spoke in a tone that made it clear the discussion was ending. The council would take humanity's concerns under advisement. They would form a committee to study the data. Another session would be scheduled in 3 cycles to discuss findings and potential responses. Dae-sung's heart sank. 3 cycles was too long. By then, the swarm would be at the council's doorstep. He tried to protest, but Vaktar spoke over him. The prelate stated that humanity needed to understand its place. The council had maintained galactic peace for thousands of years. They did not make hasty decisions based on unverified claims from junior species. The other council members made various sounds of agreement. The meeting was clearly over. Dae-sung and Hana were dismissed with a wave of Vaktar's hand. Guards appeared to escort them back to their ship. As they walked through the long corridors leading to the docking bay, Dae-sung felt defeat weighing on him. They had failed. Earth was on its own. Humanity would have to face this threat without the Council's help or resources. Billions of lives hung in the balance, and the galaxy's leaders had simply refused to listen. Hana touched his arm gently. She reminded him that they had done everything they could. The data was solid. The warning was clear. If the Council chose not to act, that was their choice. Now humanity needed to focus on survival. Just before they reached their ship, a figure emerged from a side passage. It was Ambassador Thurine, a being covered in soft gray fur with large, intelligent eyes. Thurine was the Council's military coordinator, responsible for organizing defense fleets across Council space. The ambassador glanced around nervously, then moved close to Hana. Thurine pressed something small and cold into Hana's palm. A data chip, the ambassador spoke in a whisper, barely audible over the station's ambient noise. Some Council members believed humanity's warning. Some understood the danger. But they were bound by protocol, by the rules that governed Council decisions. They could not act openly against the majority vote. The data chip contained classified information that might help. Thurine urged them to use it wisely and to prepare for what was coming. Then the ambassador vanished back into the shadows, leaving Dae-sung and Hana standing alone in the corridor. They boarded their ship, the Resilience, in silence. As the vessel detached from the station and turned toward home, Dae-sung stood on the bridge watching the Council station grow smaller behind them. The beautiful structure represented thousands of years of civilization and cooperation. Yet when faced with a real threat, it had chosen bureaucracy over action. He thought about Earth, about the billions of people who had no idea what was coming. He thought about humanity's small fleet of ships, their limited weapons, their young technology. How could they possibly stand against something that consumed star systems? Hana joined him at the viewport. She held up the data chip Thurine had given them. Whatever information it contained might make the difference between survival and extinction. They would need every advantage they could find. The stars streamed past as the Resilience accelerated toward home. Behind them, the Galactic Council continued its debates and committees, unaware that their delay had just sealed the fate of countless worlds. Humanity's warning had been delivered and ignored. Now everyone would pay the price for that arrogance. Dae-sung made a decision. If the galaxy's leaders would not act, then humanity would. They would fight alone if necessary. They would prove that a young species could have more courage than ancient empires. The Void Swarm was coming, and Earth would be ready. The Resilience entered Earth's atmosphere 3 days after leaving the Council station. News of the failed diplomatic mission had already spread across the planet. Millions of people watched the sky, waiting to see their representatives return. They hoped for good news, for allies, for help. Instead, they got the truth. Captain Dae-sung stood before the United Earth Command in Geneva. The massive war room was filled with military leaders, scientists, and government officials from every nation. Admiral Ji-won sat at the head of the table, her silver hair tied back tightly, her expression hard as stone. She had commanded Earth's defense forces for 15 years and had seen humanity through 3 smaller conflicts with hostile alien species. But nothing compared to this. Dae-sung delivered his report without emotion. The Council had refused to act. They dismissed humanity's evidence as the mistakes of a young species. No help would come. No Council fleets would arrive. Humanity stood alone against the Void Swarm. The room fell silent. Then Admiral Ji-won stood up. She pressed a button, and red lights began flashing throughout the building. Protocol Omega was now active. Total mobilization. Every resource, every factory, every human would contribute to Earth's survival. There would be no second chances. Within hours, the world transformed. Factories that made cars began producing hull plating for warships. Assembly lines for computers switched to building weapon systems. Mines across Earth and its colonies worked day and night, extracting materials. The moon's surface became a construction zone as thousands of workers in environment suits built the foundations for something unprecedented. Engineer Hyun stood on the lunar surface, staring at the construction plans projected in his helmet display. The project was called the Bastion Line. It would be a network of automated defense platforms positioned at the edge of the solar system. Each platform carried enough firepower to destroy a small fleet. Together, they might slow the swarm down long enough for the real weapon to be ready. But Hyun knew the platforms would not be enough. Conventional weapons had failed against the swarm before. He had reviewed the data from the lost systems. Nuclear missiles simply exploded uselessly. Energy weapons were absorbed. The swarm existed partially outside normal space, phased between dimensions like a ghost. Shooting at it with regular weapons was like trying to punch fog. Dr. Mireille had a different approach. She worked in a laboratory deep beneath Earth's surface, surrounded by alien technology and theoretical physics. Mireille specialized in xenobiology, studying life forms that should not exist according to human understanding. The Void Swarm was her greatest challenge yet. She spent weeks analyzing the fragmented data from destroyed monitoring stations. The last transmissions before systems went dark. Energy signatures that made no sense. Readings that suggested the impossible. Slowly she began to understand. The swarm was not entirely in this dimension. It flickered between realities, feeding on the fabric of space itself. Mireille developed a theory. If they could destabilize the dimensional frequency the swarm used, they might force it fully into normal space. Once there, it would be vulnerable. But creating such a weapon required enormous power, more power than any human weapon system could generate. She took her findings to Hyun. The engineer studied her calculations for 2 days without sleeping. Then he came up with an idea so radical that most people thought he was insane. They would weaponize Earth's moon. The entire satellite would become a massive capacitor, storing energy drawn from the sun and Earth's core. When fired, it would release a pulse of dimensional disruptive energy across the entire solar system. Admiral Ji-won approved the plan immediately. They had no other options. Construction on the lunar weapon began alongside the Bastion line. Engineers calculated they needed 6 months to complete it. They had less than 8 weeks before the swarm arrived. The work was brutal. People volunteered in numbers that overwhelmed the military recruitment centers. Everyone wanted to help. Everyone wanted to fight. Sora was one of those volunteers. She had been a civilian shuttle pilot, transporting tourists between Earth and Mars. Now she flew supply runs to the construction sites, dodging debris fields and working without sleep. Sora's shuttle carried everything from food to fusion cores. She made 20 trips a day, every day. Her eyes burned with exhaustion, but she never complained. When reporters asked why she pushed herself so hard, she had a simple answer. This was her home. These were her people. If working herself to death meant giving humanity one more chance to survive, then that was what she would do. News began arriving from beyond Council space. The Void Swarm had appeared at the edge of Centauri territory. The first reports were confused, contradictory. Then they became horrific. Entire colony worlds went silent. Distress signals cut off mid-transmission. A Centauri battle fleet engaged the swarm near a gas giant and was destroyed in minutes. 3 million soldiers simply ceased to exist. The Council finally believed humanity's warning. Emergency sessions were called. Panic spread through their civilizations. They sent desperate messages to Earth asking for information, for help, for anything. Admiral Ji-won read each message and deleted it. Humanity had asked for help and been refused. Now the Council could face the consequences of their arrogance. But the swarm moved faster than anyone predicted. It learned from each engagement, adapted to each weapon used against it. What had been 8 weeks became 6, then 4. The lunar weapon was not ready. The Bastion line was only 70% complete. Earth's small fleet of 300 warships prepared for a battle they could not win. Captain Taeyang took command of the forward defense fleet. He was young for a fleet captain, barely 40 years old, but he had fought in the border wars and earned his rank through courage and tactical brilliance. His flagship, the Indomitable, led a formation of humanity's best ships toward Neptune's orbit. That was where they would make their first stand. Back on Earth, Dr. Mireille made a final adjustment to the resonance cannon prototype. It was a smaller version of the lunar weapon, designed to be mounted on ships. The technology was untested, experimental. It might work. It might explode and take the ship with it. But it was humanity's best weapon against an enemy that existed between dimensions. Admiral Ji-won addressed the entire planet from command headquarters. Her message was broadcast to every screen, every radio, every device capable of receiving it. She stood straight and proud, wearing her military uniform with all her medals displayed. She spoke clearly and firmly. The Council had bought humanity time by doing nothing. They thought Earth was weak, primitive, unimportant. They would learn what humans did when backed into a corner. They would learn what desperation and determination could achieve. Humanity would fight with every weapon, every ship, every person. They would not surrender. They would not flee. They would stand and defend their home no matter the cost. The speech ended with a simple declaration. Earth would not go quietly into the darkness. If the Void Swarm wanted to consume humanity, It would find that humans did not digest easily. They would be a poison in its system, a knife in its heart, and if they fell, they would fall fighting. Across the planet, in cities and towns, on space stations and colony domes, people heard those words and felt something change inside them. Fear remained, but it was joined by something stronger: determination, unity, the absolute refusal to accept extinction. Sora flew another supply run to the lunar construction site. Engineer Hyun worked for his 72nd hour straight, calculating power flow systems. Dr. Mirai prepared her resonance cannons for installation on Taeyang's ships. Captain Dae-sung trained new pilots in combat maneuvers against an enemy they had never faced. The Void Swarm crossed into Council space, consuming everything in its path. Worlds that had existed for millions of years were reduced to empty void. Civilizations that had thought themselves invincible were proven wrong. The galaxy's ancient powers were learning what humanity already knew. Sometimes being old meant being slow. Sometimes tradition meant death. And behind all the preparation hidden in secure facilities, scientists examined the data chip that Ambassador Thurene had given them. It contained Council defense protocols, weapons specifications, and something unexpected: coordinates for a network of ancient defensive stations left over from a war millions of years ago. Stations that still functioned. Stations that might be enough to turn the tide. But first, humanity had to survive the initial assault. The swarm was coming, and Neptune's orbit would run red with the sacrifice of Earth's defenders. The sensors detected it first, a massive distortion in space appearing at the edge of the solar system, exactly where Dae-sung's calculations had predicted. The Void Swarm had arrived. Captain Taeyang stood on the bridge of the Indomitable, watching the tactical display as the anomaly grew larger and larger. Around him, his crew worked in focused silence, preparing weapons and shields that might prove useless against what was coming. The swarm emerged from whatever impossible space it traveled through. It looked like a living storm cloud made of darkness and lightning. It stretched across millions of kilometers, writhing and pulsing with sickly colors that hurt to look at. Parts of it seemed solid, while other sections flickered in and out of existence. Long tendrils reached out ahead of the main mass, testing reality like a predator tasting the air. Taeyang's fleet waited at Neptune's orbit. 300 ships in tight defensive formation. They represented humanity's entire deep space navy. Every warship Earth had managed to build in 2 centuries of space travel. Against the swarm, they looked like insects facing a hurricane. The forward sensors picked up readings that made no sense. The swarm's mass kept changing. Its temperature was both absolute zero and millions of degrees simultaneously. It absorbed all electromagnetic radiation while also emitting energy across every spectrum. Dr. Mirai's analysis was correct. This thing existed in multiple dimensions at once, and conventional physics barely applied to it. Taeyang gave the order to engage. The fleet opened fire with everything they had. Nuclear-tipped missiles streaked through space by the thousands. Particle beam weapons drew lines of light across the darkness. Railguns hurled projectile after projectile at relativistic speeds. The entire fleet's firepower focused on the swarm's leading edge. The swarm barely noticed. Missiles vanished into the writhing mass without exploding. Energy beams were absorbed like water into sand. Projectiles passed through sections that were not entirely solid, striking nothing. A few conventional weapons seemed to have some effect, tearing small gaps in the swarm's structure. But those gaps closed within seconds, healing faster than humanity's weapons could damage them. Then the swarm struck back. Tendrils lashed out with impossible speed. They wrapped around the destroyer fearless and squeezed. The ship's hull crumpled like paper. Its reactor went critical, but even the explosion was absorbed by the swarm. 300 crew members died in less than a second. The tactical display showed their signal simply vanish. More tendrils reached for other ships. The fleet broke formation, scattering in 3 dimensions. Taeyang switched to guerrilla tactics. His ships moved fast, using their engines to maximum capacity. They struck at the swarm's edges, fired, and retreated before the counterattack could reach them. Hit and run! Draw it out. Slow it down. Buy time for the Bastion line to activate and the lunar weapon to charge. The battle became a desperate dance. Human ships dodged between the swarm's tendrils, sometimes passing through sections that were more ghost than matter. Communications filled with warning shouts, targeting calls, and occasionally the final screams of dying crews. The swarm was learning their patterns. adapting to their tactics with frightening speed. Pilot Sora led a squadron of 12 light attack craft into the swarm's interior. It was insane. It was suicide. It was the only way to deploy the experimental dimensional charges Dr. Mirai had designed. The small ships flew through the writhing mass surrounded by impossible colors and reality-bending horror. Half the squadron vanished in the first minute, simply ceasing to exist as if they had never been. Sora's hand shook on the controls, but she kept flying. She reached the coordinates Mirai had specified deep in the swarm's mass. Her ship released its payload of 12 dimensional charges. They detonated in sequence, creating ripples in the fabric of space. For a brief moment, the swarm recoiled. A section of it was forced fully into normal space, becoming solid and vulnerable. Taeyang's heavy cruisers immediately concentrated fire on that section. This time, the weapons worked. The swarm's matter burned and broke apart. A massive chunk of the entity was destroyed. The first real damage humanity had managed to inflict. But the victory was temporary. The swarm adapted, changing its frequency to avoid the dimensional disruption. Within minutes, the charges stopped working. Sora's squadron retreated with only 5 ships remaining. She had lost 7 comrades in less than 10 minutes. Their sacrifice had bought humanity a small advantage and a terrible realization. The swarm was intelligent. It learned every tactic used against it would only work once. Back on Earth, Dr. Mirai watched the battle data streaming in real time. She saw the swarm's adaptation and felt her stomach drop. Her resonance cannons were based on the same dimensional disruption principle as the charges. If the swarm had already learned to counter that frequency, the main weapon might fail too. She began desperately recalculating, trying to find other frequencies that might work. Engineer Hyun stood in the Lunar Weapons Control Center, surrounded by screens showing power levels and system diagnostics. The weapon needed 6 more hours to reach full charge. The Bastion Line defense platforms were activating now, adding their firepower to the battle. But it was not enough. Not nearly enough. The swarm pushed forward, destroying Neptune's outermost moons without even slowing. It was approaching Uranus now, and Taeyang's fleet was being ground down. They had started with 300 ships. Now 240 remained. The swarm had barely been scratched. Taeyang made a hard decision. He ordered his fastest ships to continue the harassment attacks, while his heavy vessels fell back to Uranus itself. The gas giant would serve as cover and a defensive anchor. Maybe they could use the planet's massive gravity well against the swarm. The fighting retreat was orderly but costly. More ships fell to the swarm's tendrils. The cruiser Dauntless was caught and crushed. The destroyer Valiant's engines failed and it was swallowed by the dark mass. Each loss was hundreds of lives, years of construction, irreplaceable resources. But the fleet held together. At Uranus, Taeyang set a trap. He positioned his ships on the far side of the planet, using it as a shield. The Bastion Line platforms floated in a defensive grid around them. When the swarm arrived and moved to envelope the planet, Taeyang ordered a concentrated bombardment of Uranus's atmosphere. Fusion bombs detonated in the gas giant's clouds, creating a massive explosion that tore through the swarm's forward sections. It was a desperate tactic that would have been condemned as insane under any other circumstances. But it worked. The explosion destroyed a significant portion of the swarm and drove the rest back. For the first time, humanity had actually hurt the entity. The fleet cheered. The celebration lasted exactly 30 seconds. Then the sensors showed the swarm reforming, pulling itself back together from the scattered pieces. It had lost perhaps 10% of its mass. But it was still enormous, still coming, and now it seemed angry. The swarm's advance accelerated. It no longer probed cautiously. It rushed forward like a predator who had been stung and wanted revenge. Taeyang's fleet was forced to retreat again, falling back toward Saturn. The running battle continued, ship after ship making desperate stands and final sacrifices. The Indomitable's engines were damaged by a glancing blow from a swarm tendril. The ship could still fight but could not run. Taeyang looked at his tactical display and saw the situation clearly. His flagship was crippled. The swarm was closing fast. If he stayed to fight, he would die along with his crew. If he abandoned ship, they might escape, but the Indomitable would be lost. He made his choice quickly. Taeyang ordered evacuation. His crew protested, but he overrode them. 300 people fled the ship in escape pods and shuttles, protected by the remaining fleet vessels. Once they were clear, Taeyang sealed himself on the bridge alone. He took manual control of the Indomitable and turned it directly toward the swarm's densest concentration. The engines, even damaged, could still accelerate. He pushed them to maximum, then beyond maximum, ignoring the warning alarms and failing systems. The massive warship picked up speed, heading straight into the heart of the entity that had killed so many of his comrades. At the last moment, Taeyang opened a communication channel to the fleet. He spoke calmly, almost peacefully. He told them to fight well, to never give up, to make Earth proud. Then he detonated the Indomitable's reactor core at point-blank range inside the swarm. The explosion was visible from Saturn. It created a temporary gap in the swarm, a hole blown clean through its structure. Ships escaped through that gap, buying precious time. But everyone knew the hole would close. The swarm would heal. And Taeyang's sacrifice, while heroic, had only delayed the inevitable. 4 more hours until the lunar weapon was ready. The fleet, now under 200 ships, fell back to Jupiter. The swarm followed, relentless and unstoppable, consuming everything in its path. The Galactic Council chamber had never been so chaotic. Prelate Vokhtar stood at his throne, his golden scales now looking dull under the emergency lighting. All around him, representatives from 12 species were shouting, arguing, some making sounds of pure panic. The carefully maintained order of thousands of years had collapsed in just days. The void swarm was consuming council space. World after world went silent. The Centauri Dominion had lost 20 colony systems. The crystalline luminar species had watched 3 of their homeworlds reduced to nothing. Even the ancient Eternals, beings who had existed since before recorded history, were fleeing their territory in desperation. Vokhtar had refused to believe the reports at first. Surely the great council fleets could stop any threat. They had technology refined over millennia. They had weapons that could crack planets. They had never lost a war. But the swarm cared nothing for reputation or history. It simply consumed, and nothing the council threw at it made any difference. Ambassador Thureen entered the chamber carrying data tablets and looking exhausted. The military coordinator had not slept in days trying to organize a coherent defense. But it was hopeless. The council's military doctrine was based on established protocols, tested strategies, and proven tactics. None of it worked against an enemy that existed partially outside reality itself. A representative from the Aqueous Collective made gurgling sounds of accusation. They pointed at Vokhtar, demanding to know why the human warning had been ignored. The humans had been right. They had predicted this exact scenario. If the council had listened, if they had prepared, maybe billions would not have died. Vokhtar's 4 eyes narrowed. He wanted to argue, to defend his decision. But the evidence was undeniable. Humanity, the juvenile species he had dismissed as primitive, had detected the threat when the council's superior sensors had found nothing. They had been right, and his arrogance had doomed countless lives. More transmissions arrived from the front lines. The swarm had destroyed the council's 3rd defense fleet. 7,000 ships gone in hours. The entity was accelerating toward the council's core worlds now. At its current speed, it would reach the capital station within 2 cycles. This chamber, where Vokhtar now stood, would be consumed along with everything else. Thureen stepped forward and did something that in normal times would have meant execution. The ambassador revealed a secret. 3 cycles ago, right after the humans left, Thureen had committed treason. The ambassador had leaked classified council defensive codes to humanity, access to the ancient defense network, tactical protocols, weapon specifications, everything that might help them survive. The chamber erupted in outrage. Some representatives demanded Thureen's immediate arrest. Others were too panicked to care. But Vokhtar was silent, staring at the military coordinator. Thureen had broken every rule, violated every oath, and in doing so had potentially saved civilization. At that moment, a communication arrived from Earth. Admiral Jiwan appeared as a hologram in the center of the chamber. The human admiral looked tired but fierce. She spoke bluntly, without the diplomatic language usually used in council communications. Earth was fighting the swarm. They had taken heavy losses but were still standing. They had developed weapons specifically designed to hurt the entity. Jiwan's next words shocked everyone. Humanity was willing to share their resonance cannon technology. The weapon could force the swarm into normal space, making it vulnerable. But there was a condition. The council species would have to follow human tactical coordination, not their own ancient strategies. not their tested protocols. They would have to let the juvenile species give them orders. The chamber fell silent. Vaktar felt the weight of that demand. To accept meant admitting that humanity knew better than the Council. It meant humiliation. It meant acknowledging that 200 years of human space travel had produced better solutions than 12,000 years of Centauri wisdom. His pride screamed against it, but then he looked at the status displays. 40% of Council space was gone. Billions were dead. The swarm was still coming, and nothing the Council had tried had worked. Pride was a luxury he could no longer afford. On Earth, Commander Hana stood beside Admiral Jiwan, watching the Council's response. She had been promoted after Taeyang's death, now commanding what remained of humanity's fleet. The codes Thurene had given them had helped, allowing human forces to integrate with the ancient defense stations scattered across the galaxy. But it was not enough without Council cooperation. Dr. Mireille burst into the command center with new data. She had been studying the swarm's behavior across multiple engagements. She found something crucial. The entity learned by predicting patterns. Council military doctrine was highly organized, following established rules and formations. That made it easy for the swarm to predict and counter. But humanity's tactics were chaotic, creative, unpredictable. The swarm struggled against that randomness. This was why human forces had survived longer than Council fleets. Not because they had better weapons or ships, but because human commanders made decisions based on instinct and adaptation, rather than following prescribed strategies. The swarm could not predict chaos. It could not learn what had no pattern. Mireille proposed a desperate plan. If Council forces would adopt human tactical doctrine, if they would let human commanders coordinate their movements, they might be able to create enough chaos to confuse the swarm. Combined with the resonance cannon technology, it might work, but only if the Council species trusted humanity completely. Admiral Jiwan transmitted this analysis to the Council. She explained it clearly, backing up every claim with data. The message was simple. Follow humanity's lead or watch the galaxy die. There was no middle ground, no time for debate or committees. Prelate Vaktar stood at his throne, aware that every species was watching him. As the Council's senior leader, his decision would influence everyone else. He thought about the thousands of years of Centauri dominance. He thought about the traditions and pride that had defined his people. Then he thought about the empty systems, the silent worlds, the billions already lost. He activated the galaxy-wide broadcast system. His voice reached every Council world, every ship, every station. Vaktar spoke slowly and clearly, each word carefully chosen. The Council had been wrong. Humanity had been right. The ancient species had allowed arrogance to blind them, and the cost had been catastrophic. From this moment forward, the galaxy would fight as one. But humanity would lead. Their tactics would be adopted. Their commanders would give orders. Council species would follow those orders without question. It was the only way to survive. The transmission ended. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then responses began flooding in. Some species agreed immediately, desperate for any solution. Others hesitated, pride warring with fear. But gradually, one by one, every Council species accepted the terms. On Earth, Engineer Hyun's team worked frantically to package the resonance cannon technology for mass production. The designs were sent to every species with manufacturing capability. Council factories, vastly more advanced than humanity's, began producing the weapons at incredible speed. Within hours, thousands were ready. Within a day, hundreds of thousands. Pilot Sora led training sessions for alien pilots, teaching them human combat maneuvers. She showed them how to fly unpredictably, how to break formation suddenly, how to make decisions based on instinct rather than protocol. Many alien pilots struggled with the concept. Their entire training had been about following orders and maintaining formation. Now they had to learn to be creative, even reckless. The data codes from Thurene proved invaluable. Commander Hana used them to activate the ancient defense network scattered across 40 systems. These stations had been built millions of years ago by a species long extinct. They were primitive by modern standards, but they were also numerous and already positioned strategically. With resonance cannons installed, they became formidable. Admiral Jiwan began organizing the largest military operation in galactic history. 47 species coordinating as one force. Thousands of ships, millions of soldiers, all following human tactical doctrine. The logistics were nightmare-level complex, But humanity's military leaders adapted quickly. They had to. There would be no second chance. Captain Daesung, the diplomat who had first warned the council, now found himself commanding a mixed-species fleet. His ship included crew members from a dozen different races, none of whom had worked together before. Some could barely communicate. Some had fundamental differences in how they perceived reality, but they all shared one thing: the determination to survive. The swarm continued its advance, now approaching the Sol system. The lunar weapon was almost ready. The bastion line was fully operational. The combined forces of humanity and the council were moving into position. The final battle was about to begin, and for the first time, there was something the galaxy had not felt in weeks. Hope Vokhtar stood on the bridge of a Centauri warship, now taking orders from human commanders. It was humbling. It was painful. But as he watched the tactical displays showing dozens of species working together, following the chaotic but effective human strategies, he felt something unexpected. Relief. They finally had a chance. The final battle began at the edge of the Sol system, where humanity's journey among the stars had first started 2 centuries ago. The Void Swarm filled space from horizon to horizon, a massive entity that had consumed half the galaxy. Against it stood the largest military force ever assembled. 47 species united under one command, following tactics devised by the youngest civilization among them. Admiral Jiwan stood in Earth Command, surrounded by holographic displays showing the entire battlefield. Her command staff included representatives from every major council species, all waiting for her orders. It was surreal. 6 weeks ago, these beings had dismissed humanity as primitive. Now they looked to her for salvation. The swarm approached slowly, having learned caution from its previous encounters with human forces. It probed ahead with tendrils, testing the defenses. The bastion line platforms opened fire immediately, thousands of resonance cannons striking in coordinated patterns. The swarm recoiled, sections of it forced into normal space where conventional weapons could finally hurt it. But the entity adapted quickly. Parts of it shifted frequency, avoiding the resonance effect. Other sections became more solid, accepting damage in order to push forward. It was learning again, changing its structure to counter humanity's newest weapon. Dr. Mireille watched from her laboratory and felt her blood run cold. They had one advantage, and the swarm was already finding ways around it. Jiwan saw the same data and made a split-second decision. She ordered the fleet to engage in full chaos protocol. Every ship would operate independently, choosing targets and tactics at random. No formations, no predictable patterns, nothing the swarm could learn from. It went against everything military doctrine taught. It was insane. It was humanity's only chance. The combined fleet charged forward. 40,000 ships from dozens of species, each one moving differently, attacking from unexpected angles. Centauri cruisers dove through the swarm's mass, firing in all directions. Luminar crystal ships phased partially out of normal space, matching the swarm's own trick. Human destroyers zigzagged wildly, their crews making split-second decisions based on instinct alone. Engineer Hyun's satellites deployed across the battlefield, thousands of them creating a web of dimensional disruption. Each satellite operated on a slightly different frequency, forcing the swarm to constantly adapt. Just as it adjusted to one frequency, another would hit it from a different angle. The entity writhed in what might have been pain or confusion. The lunar weapon finished charging. Hyun gave the signal and Earth's moon fired for the first time. The pulse of dimensional energy crossed the solar system in seconds, striking the swarm's core with devastating force. A massive section of the entity was torn apart. Pieces of it scattered across millions of kilometers. The swarm screamed. It had no voice, but every sensor in the fleet registered something. A vibration through space itself that felt like a howl of rage. The entity surged forward, abandoning all caution. Tendrils lashed out in all directions, catching ships that could not dodge fast enough. The Council frigate Eternal Light was crushed. A human destroyer, the Relentless, vanished into the swarm's mass. Ships from a dozen species fell in the first minutes. But the rest kept fighting, kept moving unpredictably, kept striking from impossible angles. The swarm could not predict them. It could not learn fast enough. Commander Hana led a strike force through the chaos toward the swarm's center. Dr. Mireille's analysis suggested the entity had a core, a dimensional anchor point that held it in this reality. Destroying it might banish the swarm back to wherever it came from, but reaching the core meant diving into the heart of the entity itself. Pilot Sora flew beside Hana, commanding a mixed squadron of human, Centauri, and Luminar ships. They had trained together for only 3 days, but necessity had forged them into an effective unit. They followed no formation, communicated minimally, each pilot trusting the others to do their part. The strike force penetrated the swarm's outer layers. Reality twisted around them. Some pilots reported seeing impossible colors, feeling time flow backwards, hearing the thoughts of their crewmates. The swarm's interior existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, and human minds were not meant to process such things. Sora's ship shook violently as a tendril passed through it, partially phased out of normal space. Her co-pilot, a Centauri named Vorak, frantically rerouted power around damaged systems. Behind them, 3 ships lost cohesion and simply fell apart, their matter unable to hold together in the dimensional chaos. Captain Daesung's fleet attacked from above, drawing the swarm's attention away from the strike force. His ships fired resonance cannons in random patterns, creating pockets of stability in the chaos. It was working. The swarm had to divide its focus, unable to concentrate on any single threat. The strike force reached the core. It looked like a tear in reality, a wound in the fabric of space that pulsed with wrong colors. Energy flowed from it into the swarm's mass, sustaining the entity across multiple dimensions. Dr. Mireille had been right. This was the anchor. This was the target. Hana ordered the attack. Every ship in the strike force fired everything they had at the dimensional tear. Resonance cannons, nuclear missiles, particle beams, even kinetic projectiles. The core began to destabilize, flickering like a dying star. But it was not enough. The entity's own energy held it together, resisting the assault. Sora looked at her instrument readings and made a decision. Her ship carried an experimental weapon, a resonance bomb that had never been tested. It might work. It might do nothing. But if it worked, the detonation would have to be at point-blank range, inside the core itself. The ship would not survive. She told Vorak her plan. The Centauri pilot looked at her with all 4 eyes and made a sound that the translator rendered as agreement. They had known each other for 3 days, but somehow that was enough. They understood what had to be done. Sora's ship broke from the formation and accelerated directly toward the core. Hana shouted orders to stop her, but Sora had already cut communications. The small vessel entered the dimensional tear, and reality simply stopped making sense. Sora could see her own ship from the outside, see herself sitting in the pilot's seat, see Vorak beside her, and somehow also see herself as a child on Earth and an old woman, and all versions at once. She armed the resonance bomb and detonated it. The explosion existed across multiple dimensions simultaneously. The core collapsed, the dimensional anchor severed. The tear sealed itself, and the swarm's connection to its home reality was cut. Across the battlefield, the effect was immediate. The swarm began to disintegrate. Without the anchor, it could not maintain cohesion in normal space. Pieces of it broke apart, flickering between dimensions before vanishing entirely. The massive entity that had consumed half the galaxy simply fell apart like smoke in the wind. Sora's ship emerged from the collapsing core on emergency power only. The vessel was barely holding together, but she and Vorak were alive. The strike force surrounded them immediately, protecting the damaged ship as they retreated from the dissolving swarm. Within an hour, it was over. The void swarm was gone, banished back to whatever impossible realm had spawned it. The dimensional tear sealed completely, leaving no trace it had ever existed. The combined fleet hung in space, their weapons silent, barely able to believe they had survived. The victory came at terrible cost. 15,000 ships had been lost. Millions of soldiers were dead. Entire systems had been consumed, worlds that could never be recovered. But the galaxy still existed. Life continued. The swarm had been stopped. 10 days later, the Galactic Council convened on Earth for the first time in their history. The ancient chamber on Proxima Centauri was gone, consumed by the swarm. Now they met in Geneva, in a building hastily modified to accommodate different species. Prelate Vokhtar stood before the assembly and did something no Centauri had done in 12,000 years.
He apologized.
Not with excuses or political language, but honestly and directly. The Council had been wrong. Their arrogance had nearly destroyed civilization. They had dismissed humanity's warning because of pride, and billions had paid for that mistake. He proposed something radical. The old council structure would be dissolved. In its place, a new galactic alliance would form. Every species would have equal representation, regardless of age or technology level. Earth would be granted a founding seat not as a junior member but as an equal partner. The vote was unanimous. The council era was over. A new age had begun, forged in the fires of shared struggle. Species that had ruled for millennia learned to accept guidance from those they once considered children. The lesson was hard but clear. Wisdom came not from age but from the willingness to adapt. Captain Dae-sung, promoted to ambassador, gave the closing speech. He spoke simply, without grand language. Humanity had not saved the galaxy to prove they were right or to gain power. They did it because it was necessary. Because when someone is drowning, you do not wait for committee approval. You jump in and help. The new alliance ratified its charter that day. Joint colonies would be established on worlds devastated by the swarm. Technology would be shared freely between all species. Military forces would remain unified, ready to face any future threats together. The old barriers of species and status were replaced with something stronger.